I'd like to welcome everyone to the Nashville Bar Association Town Hall meeting with the Nashville Metropolitan Chief Public Defender, Martesha Johnson. We're holding these town hall meetings to allow members of the legal community in Nashville to hear from our judges and elected officials about the changing procedures in our courts and other concerns for our community in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Martesha, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd like to get started with a broad question just about how the changing procedures in our criminal courts have been affecting your clients of the Public Defender's Office.
I think mainly the procedure changes kind of require us to every day be flexible. And flexibility is not always something that our clients have in great abundance. And so we have to figure out how to balance doing our work with making sure our clients have our best. And so when you think about the main changing procedures being the closing down of certain dockets, the closing down of the courthouse, and just operationally how we are able to see our clients in custody, because procedure changes have taken place there, and we're mainly utilizing video conferencing. We don't have many bond cases happening in the courthouse right now, and so keeping in touch with those clients and also just navigating how we practice when the procedures in place at the courthouse are in place to think about public health, but are not always really conducive to being helpful to us doing our work. So I think it requires us to always be thinking about how we change, how we represent our clients, and how we function ourselves in our office, because we've also had sort of changing procedures to have to implement during this time.
For clients of the Public Defender's Office, have you been having any kind of in-person proceedings?
We do have in-person court proceedings. We also, our office is open because courts are open. So we still have to be open to provide our service. We have strongly encouraged people utilize virtual options and phone options to contact us to do intake. And we have been utilizing video conferencing for our clients more so than we ever have before. We've started to sort of make that the first step at seeing our clients. And if you can't access them via video, then we would say go over to the jail houses and do a non-contact visit with clients. And then contact visits are sort of the last resort for us to see our clients in this time. Yeah. And then in court, every day there are dockets running that require our in-person contact. So jail dockets mainly in general sessions, which means we have lawyers who are working all of our jail dockets, and they're still having hearings and trials where they happen. And we are still going to criminal court dockets. Now, a lot of that, they're trying to allow the parties to try and settle or work out those matters before setting them on a docket, but we're still in court every time there is a docket running, having in-person proceedings.
For the meetings and the matters that you are handling by remote means, is there a common software program that's being utilized? And what you specifically mentioned visits to the jails, how are those being coordinated when they're being handled by remote video means?
So we utilize for our own in-office meetings, and some of the meetings that I've had in the court system, we're utilizing Zoom most frequently. The video conferencing technology that we have in our office, we had before the pandemic began, and that is pretty much an ITS setup where we have the tech support through our office to dial into all of the local jail facilities, and we just have video conferencing monitors in our office that we can dial up and dial into those units over at the local jails. If we needed to see a client that is in the Department of Corrections, that process is it's still video. It is handled through the Department of Corrections, but we don't have a monitor in our office for that to happen. We would have to set that up, have it confirmed with TDOC, and then go over to the courthouse to utilize the monitor there to see a client via video. So we don't have a lot of stations to do video conferencing, but we do utilize that for our clients. And if we are speaking to each other, either team meetings or leadership meetings, we've even had virtual staff meetings at this point. We've been doing that, and virtual trainings we've been doing with our staff via Zoom.
For those clients that are not in jail, has technology been a challenge, or have you found that most people have some means of connecting by video?
I mean, a lot of people have cell phones, a lot of people have technology, but the client population that we represent, sometimes our clients do not have access to those things. And then, yes, it is challenging when essentially you may have known your court date before the pandemic sort of started, and now that court date has been moved indefinitely, we might have some trouble getting in touch with all of our clients who are more transient or experiencing homelessness, because it might not be that easy to get in touch with them as it was when the court dates were happening more regularly. We do find that a lot of people have phones. A lot of people, they do. Those numbers change frequently. When you start to talk about Zoom capabilities and whether someone can dial into a Zoom hearing, I think our concerns there are that technology may not be available vastly with our client population. And so we're currently exploring whether that's a service we can provide to our clients to be able to come in and utilize the technology, and whether we can provide that to be able to communicate with our clients more virtually as well.
For the in-person dockets that are still ongoing, what sort of social distancing measures are the attorneys in your office taking, and the clients of your office?
So if you followed this discussion that we had, which started a while ago, but particularly when I filed the motion requesting mass release for individuals in custody charged with nonviolent misdemeanor and low-level felony offenses, one of the main components of that is that social distancing is impossible for people who are in custody. Our sheriff has said that, public health individuals across the country, doctors, people who have more degrees and are smarter than me have been saying that it is impossible to socially distance in the jail. And the same holds true for even at our courthouse. Our courthouse basement is where most of our clients who are coming to court right now on these general sessions dockets, they're being held there in the basement. The basement has essentially holding cells that correspond with what courtroom you will be going to for the day. And while the numbers are less for the dockets that we're having and the number of people required to be there, the holding cells are there's still people being housed collectively. They would have no ability to just house one person per holding cell in the basement. And so social distancing as it relates to our clients is almost impossible to do. There is also not really a good means of them being able to do the hygiene recommendations that are being provided by the CDC, because they don't have their own hand sanitizer. They have hand washing stations, but the ones in the courthouse have water provided, but there aren't any sort of soap dispensers there for the client to use that either. And so then you talk about, we have to see our clients there in the basement, and then we come to the courtrooms. Most of the judges have implemented a 10-person in the courtroom rule in an effort to maintain appropriate social distancing. But it's very difficult to do that when you have to still talk to clients. You still have to report information to family members who may be there. You still have to interview a witness that may have shown up to the courtroom. You might need to ask a question to an officer on a case. And those individuals are still just there in the courthouse. They've been asked to wait in the hall for the most part, and we still have to interact with them. So doing the best you can to try and provide a service that your clients deserve, while also protecting their constitutional rights, is hard to do. You're trying to navigate, am I standing 6 feet away from this witness, while also trying to get good information? If I'm talking to my client, am I protecting their confidentiality? It is just really hard to maneuver all of that. But I can say my staff has been doing amazing work. They're very committed and dedicated in trying to do the best they can in terms of social distancing, wearing masks, and keeping at the forefront of our minds how we can try and be as safe as possible.
Talk to us a little more about the challenges of being the public defender at this time in our country.
it is extremely challenging. I am in my second year of this position, though I am going on my 12th year of being a public defender. And, you know, I've had to learn some really fast lessons in leadership. And I am grateful for that opportunity, because having to navigate how to lead in a pandemic is tough. But I think, you know, I read an Atlantic article recently that talked about leadership really showing up when you have to navigate it during a pandemic, and that is 100% true. You have to constantly really bring your best self. And I have been trying to manage how to lead, how to be vulnerable with my staff, and understanding that this is tough. Not only is it tough for them because they're in court every day, it's tough for me as well to sometimes feel like I'm sort of the only voice of the people we represent, you know, and sometimes it feels really hard to have discussions about why we need to be thinking about releasing people from jail when sometimes humanity doesn't exist for those people. And it is hard to have discussions about, you know, do we really want some of these misdemeanor sentences to turn into a potential death sentence, when sometimes people believe that that position from the public defender and from the assistant public defenders is just our means of trying to be up in arms about everything. We're being extra. We are making everything seem bigger than it is. And that is just a really tough space to practice. It is a tough space to be in when essentially we have become experts in communicating bad news, and that's a part of the work. But here, during a time where you have people's family members calling you mothers and fathers, people who care about their loved ones who are incarcerated, and the answers that we have to provide to them are, there's nothing I can do. I essentially cannot get your loved one out of TDLC custody. I understand that they have had a massive outbreak. I don't have a lot of answers for what can happen to your loved one here in local custody. We're trying, but giving that bad news during this time is incredibly difficult. It's also incredibly difficult because we want to be really good at what we do, right? And so to say that we have to sort of press pause on how we practice, and I've had to send lawyers home to work from home. I've had to, you know, navigate how we investigate and do social services during this time. And we have a real way of how we do our business. And so to now sort of say, we have to slow that down a little bit, be creative, and not be as hands-on as we once were, that's really, really hard to tell a bunch of people who are ready to fight all the time.
You mentioned that you filed a petition regarding the early release of certain incarcerated persons. Could you talk to us a little bit about the motivations for filing the petition, and then what you're seeing after the orders that were put down by our criminal and general sessions courts?
Sure. It took a couple of weeks before I decided to actually file the mass motion. And the reason for that is we had a sort of a process in place for which we were trying to ask for the release of people from custody. And we had successfully gotten some people released from custody. The process had been essentially from day one. The sheriff and I just called him and said, look, I need lists of individuals who fall in certain categories. And he very swiftly provided those. And then I would send that information over the district attorney's office, and General Funk would review those with his deputies and then get back to me on those individuals who they believed they could agree to some sort of release for. And we did that in a number of cases. I think our initial effort to reduce the jail population resulted in almost 200 people having at least an agreed offer of release. Now, those had to be approved by judges, and so not all of them were released that way. But as I continued to think about it, you know, it took us probably almost 2.5, close to 3 weeks to really be able to go through the number of cases that we did. And that was about 270 cases that we reviewed initially. That took a while. And we didn't have time. We didn't have the time to sort of wait and see whether COVID-19 was going to enter our jail facilities, because we knew that was going to happen. We felt pretty strongly that because of the revolving door of how the jail operates, because of the inability to social distance, that the virus was going to enter the jail. And because of that, I started to think about how could we do, one, the sheriff who sent a letter to all of the judges asking to reduce the jail population, how could we address that issue? And also address the issue that I talked about before, which is the humanity piece of this, what I think is what the 8th Amendment is about, cruel and unusual punishment, and thinking about like the people who are in custody, who we could safely release back into the community during this time. It's something that we should be thinking about. We should be making efforts to do that. I don't think anybody intends, we're talking about people whose sentences would carry up to 11 months and 29 days on a misdemeanor, or on the felonies that I'm talking about, the lower level nonviolent felonies. These are sentences that people will eventually return to our communities on anyway. And so when you're thinking about all of that, and I'm thinking about the timing, I'm thinking about all of the medical science that has come out over the past few days. And right around that time, there was an op-ed in the Tennessean by Dr. Gaddy, who testified at our hearing. I thought, as the public defender, it is my job, it is our duty, it is, this is the thing that has pricked me since I started this job, to speak out for our clients, to speak out for the people who are probably screaming it from the jail cells right now, but don't have anyone saying it for them out in the community. And so feeling compelled to do that, also balancing, we're able to pretty quickly address our client needs sometimes, but sometimes there are people over in the jail who might fall into this category who don't have the ability to get in touch with a lawyer or to get back in court on a suspended sentence motion on their own. And I just thought that the best method for us to address this would be to secure the mass release of individuals in those categories. So people who were charged with nonviolent offenses and unable to make their bail, or they had already been sentenced in those categories and were within 60 days of their release, or their charge was nonviolent, their conviction was nonviolent. And I still think that would have been the best method of reducing the jail population and also addressing this as the public health crisis that it is. Other jurisdictions have done it. Other states have successfully done this. And I thought that here in Nashville, that was the best method for us to do it as well. And so that was my thought process. There were a lot of, things that went into that bucket. I had moms and family members calling me, and I thought that it was my duty to do that. It was the best thing that I could do in this pandemic for the people that I say I care about and that I represent, and was very honored to be able to do that.
We've seen news reports about various outbreaks in jails and prisons in Tennessee and across the country. And here in Tennessee in particular, some of the news reports have said that the vast majority of incarcerated persons who have a COVID diagnosis are asymptomatic. Is your experience in talking with clients and your lawyer's experience in talking with clients, does it confirm that?
Well, so there's a challenge there, because if our clients have been deemed either positive or exhibiting symptoms, or even as a part of a pod that had one of those individuals in it, they have been quarantined, which means that their access to us and the public and the courts and everyone else is very limited. So we're not able to speak to them like we would if they weren't in a quarantine pod. So our ability to speak to our clients who have been quarantined is severely hampered at this point. We've had some medical consultations for our own office in considering how we reopen successfully and how we maintain the safety. And so what we have heard is a large number of the population who has been diagnosed with COVID-19 have been asymptomatic. So that's something that we've heard. I don't have any reason to not believe that, but I've also heard accounts of what's happening in the prison facilities, and that is where guards are being tasked with being medical professionals who have no experience in that. People who have been sick and are sick, who are still in pods with people who tested negative. Details about individuals who are on ventilators in the facility, and just sort of like the mass request of individuals in those facilities to get information well before the news reports broke about how many people at Trousdale and Bledsoe County had the virus. You had people there who were housed there who were saying, we have problems, we have concerns, and we need to be heard. And it took a while, and it took too long. And, you know, it goes back to what I said earlier about where is our humanity for people who we incarcerate, right? Just because they're there, just because they may have been convicted of offenses, does not mean we don't owe them the protection and the care that they deserve in one of our state or local run jail facilities. And so I don't know whether all of the people they reported are asymptomatic. I believe that to be an extremely high number of folks who 98% of the cases they're saying are asymptomatic. But even if that is the case, I think what we have learned is that that changes day to day. And we have also heard accounts from our clients of people who have been really sick and are still at the facilities there with them.
I want to take a short pause just to remind everybody who has joined this town hall that if you have a question for Martesha Johnson, if you will use the chat function at the bottom of the screen and send me your question or send it across to everyone, I'll be sure to ask your question. Can you talk to us a little bit about communications between you and the District Attorney General and our courts, the sheriff you mentioned? How have communications among the leaders in our criminal justice system been handled? How are they going?
I think I have probably talked to those individuals more in the past month than I ever have in my entire career. And I don't even mean just within the hours of 8 to 5. You know, some of these communications are taking place over the weekend, late at night. I've talked to the sheriff so many times I can't count. And it has become very familiar almost that I will probably have, at first it was probably a daily discussion, at least with the sheriff. And for a while, a daily discussion with General Funk. At this point, you know, I think communication is ongoing. I think we are communicating often. You know, we disagree on how to handle certain things, and we disagree on certain methods, and, you know, but we have been talking. There's a lot of talking going on. I think I've had more Zoom calls and emails and phone calls than I can really almost stand at this point.
Have you seen an increase or a decrease in any particular types of cases since this pandemic really hit here in Nashville?
We have seen a decrease in the number of people who are on our jail dockets since before the pandemic. And so we have to assume that is either because the police department has been issuing more citations in lieu of physical arrests, or because the crime or the offenses that were being brought in are down. Either way, we've seen those docket numbers decrease. We've seen our numbers in our jail right now decrease. And so that, I think those things are good during this time. Initially, the numbers sort of went up a little bit, and then there was an effort to make sure that people understood that we needed to try and bring less people into the jail. And we have seen some decreases on our dockets, at least for people being brought in on our jail dockets. I can't speak to sort of specific offenses. I just don't have the data to be able to give you, you know, a certain type of case that is down or up, you know.
We have a question from a member of our audience.
Okay.
And the question is, as a private citizen, a member of the public, what can I do to help you improve the conditions of our criminal justice system? Who should I talk to? What's most important?
That's a great question. And I often say that sometimes it's really challenging, a really heavy load to bear, to feel like you're sort of the only voice speaking about these issues for our clients. So I think if private citizens are passionate about this and concerned, which I think you should be, I think that the justice system it affects all of us. How we treat the people coming into the justice system is reflective on who we are as a community. And so I think that if that's something you're passionate about, if that's something that you want to help in, then I think there are a few things you can do. You can elevate your voice in support of this cause. I tell people often that, you know, we are public defenders in the work, doing the work every day on the front lines, right? But people can be public defenders in their own walk. You can be a public defender as a school teacher. You can be a public defender as whatever your occupation is. And that means you embody the spirit of liberty, humanity, and justice for everybody, regardless of what they look like, regardless of how much money they make, and regardless of their socioeconomic background. And so you could be that voice wherever you are. You can do court watching, which I think is critical for anybody who wants to know what happens in the court system and wants to really know what happens. I think you should do court watching. Now, that might be limited, and that's something that I think is an issue to watch for people who are in the legal field, but also for people in the public. Court watching and court proceedings being open to the public is something that, you know, you're entitled to do. But I think in the pandemic, and as you talk about how to keep people safe, that's one of the discussions that's happening on how do we limit folks from coming into the courthouse. And so I do think court watching is important. I think that being really knowledgeable about things affecting the criminal justice system is a duty that we all have. And so learning as much as you can, I'm willing to talk to and host anybody about this discussion as I can, and keeping your eye on the issues and speaking up about those issues. And most importantly, all of the positions, including my own, in the criminal justice system are elected positions, which means that the people who put us into these roles are right out there in our community, are the private citizens that go to and fro every day. And so paying attention and being a part of this, it helps you then when it's your civic duty to vote and be knowledgeable about the issues.
Talk about jury trials for a moment, because as it stands right now, under the Tennessee Supreme Court order, jury trials won't resume until July at the earliest. Can you speak to us a little bit about the right to a speedy trial and how that plays into not being able to have trials, and what concerns you have about backlog?
So certainly we have concerns about backlog. People who have had their case set for trial and that case has been removed from the trial docket because of this pandemic. But even more so, I think about other things. I think about what happens when the courts go back to normal, whatever normal looks like for the next few months. And then there becomes the pressure to move through the dockets and move through the case. And essentially the same schedule that all of the people in the justice system have been on, we've had to experience that. We've had to experience businesses being closed, which limits our ability to do the type of investigations we need to do. So I'm thinking about, what do investigations look like for cases that need to go to trial during a pandemic? I'm thinking about how do we select jurors and make sure that we are questioning jurors around the coronavirus, and not whether they've had it, but their response to it, how they are feeling about coming down to a courthouse to serve on a jury when everything you hear in the news every day is about exposure and limiting your exposure. Because what you don't want is people serving on your jury whose mind is preoccupied with something else and they're not tuned in to the facts that are being presented to them. I think about the effects of the virus on the population and how that affects our jury pool. You know, what we have heard from the medical population is that the vulnerable people are being affected the most, and that we're learning that it is extremely harsh to African Americans. And so how will that impact our ability to get a pool? And will it impact it? And is that something that we need to be thinking about in the aftermath of all of this, when we sort of return to doing trials? And, you know, I think that there's not going to be a situation for a while that we will be able to impanel juries like we have done, which is to bring them all on the same day and prepare them to go to jury trials and in the courts over at the courthouse. I think that is going to be limited, and we're not going to be able to go back to that for a while. And so then you have clients who may say, I want my speedy trial. I want it. I'm not really interested in the Supreme Court putting these trials on hold. And then we have to transition as public defenders to, it's our job to advocate for those rights. So Do we need to start filing motions related to that? Those are questions that we are sort of asking ourselves in these public defender circles. And it's a lot to think about. I just add that to sort of the bucket of challenges that is being a public defender right now. Certainly jury selection is on my mind because juries decide the fate of the person in front of them. And so it's very important. And those issues, I think, are ahead of us in terms of what we need to think about with juries.
We have another question from our audience. The question is, when people run for office in the criminal justice arena, what questions should I be asking? What qualities should I be looking for? What red flags should I be wary of?
So I'm going to preface this by saying those questions are going to have to come from what your values are. I can tell you what my values are and what I look for when I'm thinking about somebody who is going to be elected to a position of service in Nashville or anywhere for that matter. But I really think you have to determine what your values are. So my values are, I want somebody who, if we're talking about a elected judicial position, I want somebody who really, I mean, that role requires fairness and impartiality, right? And so that is something that we're going to hear, hopefully, all of the candidates talking about. But I want to know what that really means to that person. What does fairness and impartiality means? And then I think you have to look at their record. You have to do court watching for that. I am a person who wholeheartedly believes that people are more than the worst thing they've ever done. And so I am looking to, what are your values around what the role of the justice system is? Are we talking about people who believe in retribution at all times? Are we talking about people who are willing to look at restorative practices and how we can do more of that? Because what we do know is that incarcerating people has not made our communities more safe, and it does not if the answer is always go to jail, that is not going to do anything to make us safer as a community, nor does it help the people we're sending to those facilities. And we are learning more of that every day. So to answer your question and not get on my soapbox about my own personal thoughts, I would encourage you to learn your own values around that, around the people who come into the court system, the issues related to criminal justice. And some of those are, you have to be knowledgeable about money bail and rehabilitation and parole and all of these things that go into this criminal justice system. And then once you know what your values are, you look to people and you question them on those values.
How is COVID-19 forcing us to rethink or retool the criminal justice system?
I would like to hope that it is forcing us to realize that if we can make the type of efforts that we have made to reduce the jail population in the middle of a pandemic, we can do it all the time. If we have figured out how to be flexible and think about alternative ways of what we've been doing for forever, then that's something we need to take with us out of the pandemic. And that's one of the things that I am glad about. I am glad that we have been able to reduce the jail population. And I am glad that we have been able to say, hey, if you can issue more citations in lieu of arrest, you should do that. And I am glad that we have issued orders to the magistrates that say, you can issue more summonses during this time rather than warrants. Those are tools that I think you can use. But if we can use them during the pandemic, we can use them outside of this as well and limit the number of people we are bringing into these jails to be the people who absolutely need to be there. And we can have a debate on who those folks are at some other time. But I think that's something that we should really be trying to carry with us when this is over.
I want to remind the audience again, if you have any questions, please use the chat function and I'll be sure to ask them. I've been asking in these town hall meetings about silver linings, or if there's anything in particular that you are grateful for that has come out of this pandemic situation.
I am really, really grateful for our Nashville Defenders team. I mean, I was that way before this, but just watching how we have had to maneuver and seeing the difficulty that many of the lawyers and staff in my office have had to face during this time and to still be resilient and trying to do this work. I'm really grateful for that. I'm really grateful to be able to lead an office that puts their passion into this work every day. And sometimes I have to try and say, I know you're passionate, but I need you to also think about yourselves. I need you to operate self-care. I think I've become the self-care mantra person in my office, because I'm screaming that all the time in every meeting. Even now, I'm on Zoom saying, do some self-care. But I really think, our team is like none other. And I have said it before, as many times as I can say it. I really think there's no justice without the public defender's office. And I'm really grateful for our staff and our team that do this work. I'm also grateful to be able to represent our clients and to be able to continue to advocate and hopefully bring pressure around the city to do things differently. I'd like to hope that my voice in these spaces is helpful. It brings a perspective that requires you to think differently and requires you to think in maybe a way you never thought about thinking before. And so I'm grateful that in a time like this, in a pandemic, that I was the person selected and voted into this office to be able to lead and elevate my voice like this. Took me a minute to get there. I'm not gonna say my ego hasn't been bruised at times during this process, and I haven't been frustrated and upset, and I haven't, jokingly threatened to plan my retirement, if I'm just being quite honest here. Took me a minute to get there, but I wholeheartedly believe that I was put here for a moment, and this is one of those moments that I was put here for. And so I'm glad to be able and grateful to be able to lead and advocate during this time. I'll be able to tell my grandchildren and great-grandchildren that when a pandemic was happening in this country, I was asking for people to be released from jail. And I think, and I hope, and I know they'll be proud of that.
What, if any, changes that we've seen in our criminal justice system do you think will continue on past this pandemic, whether it's technology or how we're handling dockets or something that I haven't even thought of? What do you think we'll see down the road in the future?
I think there will be some pushes to continue some of the technology changes that we've had. And I think that is something that we have to be mindful of and concerned about, that we don't put convenience over, people and really what needs to happen in the courthouse. I do think there will be efforts to keep some of the technology in place. I hope, like I said, there will be efforts to keep some of these changes related to who we bring into custody and how we think about the cases that come through the court system, and how we think about dockets, and how we think about, even the smallest thing, like how we house people in a jail, how we house people in a basement of a courthouse, and how we move people through the system. I hope that there are conversations that can happen that continue well past this at least initial pandemic phase. I do think we still have plenty of this ahead of us.
I want to give everyone one more opportunity. If you have a question for Martesha Johnson, please submit it across the Zoom group chat. We know that individual judicial districts are currently coming up with plans for partially resuming in-person hearings that have been on hold during this time. What insight can you give us into what's going to happen in the 20th Judicial District?
I don't have a whole lot of insight that I can share at this point, because I don't think any of those plans have been finalized. There have been discussions. We have hosted Dr. Hildreth from Meharry over at the courthouse. He did a tour of the facility and gave some very helpful feedback about the things we needed to be mindful of before we reopen the courts. And all of that is what we've been hearing every day about: wearing masks, increasing the cleanings that are taking place in the courthouse, providing more hand sanitizer stations, and trying to operate with social distancing in mind. And so I know that that conversation has been happening. Conversations around not bringing every single person back into the courthouse and trying to do it over a gradual phasing has happened. And I think those are things that will be looking to be implemented. I don't know that it's going to be easy or that we won't have to modify it a few times throughout this process. But those are the types of conversations that are happening. How do we stagger dockets? How do we, I hope, try and implement some of the things that Dr. Hill just talked about. And for me, you know, I want to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're not making it more difficult for people who are already marginalized, people already having a tough time, people who may have lost their jobs during this pandemic, to navigate this system that can already be sort of tough and harsh to poor people. And so I know that those conversations are happening. I believe that those plans for our district will be rolled out over the next couple of weeks. And so we'll see what some of that looks like at that time.
What else is important for lawyers and people in our community to know about the work of your office during this time?
I think it's important to know that we are still working. If you think about what the front lines looks like in the healthcare sphere, there are those challenges that are there, but the dedication of all of those people who are still doing that work, that's the equivalent of what the public defenders are doing every day in the system. And I'm not saying that to say that no other person in the system is doing their work. I'm using my time to talk about our office and what we do. We are certainly continuing to be on the front lines of advocating for our clients and advocating for issues that are very real for people. And I think that's important to know. I think it's important to know that it's incredibly hard to do this work. And the passion that goes into being able to do it, and even keeping that passion during a pandemic, is worth talking about and is worth people understanding. And we don't often tell our stories. We don't often like to even talk about us as lawyers, because we feel like we're not heroes. We are just doing the jobs that we've signed up to do. And in most scenarios, I would agree. I would say, you know, I don't want any shine as a public defender. I'm not doing this for that. But in this scenario, I do think it is extremely important to recognize the folks who are doing this work every day and have been in court every day. And I just can't say it enough. That's what you need to know. I do also think that we need to be paying attention to how policies and procedures affect the clientele that we represent in the public defender's office. So paying attention to what happens at the rescue mission and what happens in the prison facilities and what happens in the local jails is very important to us. And so I hope then very important to people in the community.
We really appreciate you being with us today. I failed to mention at the beginning of this session that you are also a member of the board of directors of the Nashville Bar Association. So we appreciate your work for the board as well.
Thank you.
And thank you for giving us your time today and answering our questions.
Sure, I enjoyed it.
And this will bring our town hall meeting to a close. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.